We are now in the package films era of Disney. When we entered World War II, the whole country had to conserve resources in the fight against the Axis. Disney put many projects on hold for the time being, and worked on wartime cartoons. Some were entertaining propaganda pieces, some were purely educational, and some were part of the good neighbor policy to try to sway South America to the Allies' side. This meant that while some great movies and shorts like The Three Caballeros and Education for Death were produced, Walt Disney couldn't work on the full-scale animated features that he was passionate about. Even after World War II ended, the company had trouble recovering. Out of the last string of conventional movies they had made, only Snow White and Dumbo had been full-blown financial successes. Other movies had not fared as well with contemporary audiences, particularly Fantasia, which had not been cheap to make. To save money, Disney began releasing anthologies of shorts, which were dubbed package films. I mentioned Make Mine Music at the end of the Dumbo and Bambi entry, and now we are looking at 1947's Fun and Fancy Free. The movie is a combination of two featurettes, Bongo and Mickey and the Beanstalk. Both were envisioned as being produced as individual full-length movies before World War II put a stop to their production. First, we'll take a look at Bongo, and its villain, Lumpjaw. Disney has often been accused of sanitizing stories they adapt, but up to this point, most of their movies had retained the general gist of their source material. The edits made to Snow White, Pinocchio, and Bambi were mostly for pacing purposes. For example, although Pinocchio himself was made much less harsh than the original puppet character, the trials he faced in the Disney movie were still daunting and often terrifying, so the dark feeling of the book was still there. Disney's take on Bongo was arguably the first time they really rewrote a story to such an extreme degree. Little Bear Bongo by Sinclair Lewis was first published in Cosmopolitan in 1930. The short story follows Bongo, a performing bear in a traveling circus. He is incredibly happy with his life, but a train crash and the resulting fire forces him to flee into the woods for safety. He eventually finds his way to a community of bears and tries befriending them. Bongo, however, has been domesticated, or as the story likes to say, civilized, and does not know how to properly behave around the other bears. His performances that thrilled human audiences confuse the bears and make them think he's crazy. Bongo tries sharing the food he's able to find or hunt, which is unheard of, and his general pacifism only further alienates him from the rougher bears. He is soon a laughingstock and a freak. Bongo falls in love with a bear named Silver Ear. She slaps him, and as is customary for those bears, he is supposed to slap her back. Bongo does not understand this, and Silver Ear takes it as an insult and rejection. She instead chooses to be mates with a huge bear named Lumpjaw. After almost starving during winter, Bongo finds that Silver Ear and Lumpjaw have had cubs. Heartbroken, Bongo leaves the woods and is able to find a different circus, who are happy to take him in. Bongo does at least find love in captivity with another circus bear. The story ends with telling us that Bongo finally came from the burdens of freedom and the horrors of nature to the happy civilization of his cage. As you can see, Disney took this dark, cynical story and turned it into a much more conventionally cheerful piece, without any trace of Lewis's satire. Bongo is now unhappy at the beginning, very much aware that he is a prisoner. He intentionally escapes from the train, unable to resist the call of the wild. Although he has a bit of trouble adapting to nature and the social norms of the bears, he is able to be accepted into the pack and find romance in the span of about 2 days. Perhaps if the story had been a full-length movie as originally planned, we would have seen Bongo face more hardships, but nothing indicates that the longer draft had any of the bleak parts of Lewis's original text. Lumpjaw is the closest thing in the original story to a villain, although none of the bears are really that nice to Bongo. Lumpjaw just had the distinction of being a romantic rival to Bongo, and winning in the end. Once again, the Disney version has a more conventional storyline, where Lumpjaw is a dangerous, bullying brute who Bongo has to defeat to get the girl, named Lulabelle in this version. In the Disney take on the story, Bongo and Lulabelle are instantly smitten with each other, and jealous Lumpjaw is quick to resort to violence. Lulabelle comes to Bongo's defense and slaps him in a show of affection. Like in the original story, Bongo doesn't understand, and Lulabelle accidentally slaps Lumpjaw instead. This leads to a country hoedown in celebration of love, which finally tips Bongo off about what's going on. Now realizing Lulabelle loves him, Bongo challenges Lumpjaw and uses his circus tricks to get the upper hand. He and Lumpjaw go over a waterfall in the end, but of course Bongo makes it out okay, while Lumpjaw is washed away downstream. The relationship between Bongo, Lulabelle, and Lumpjaw is comparable to the one between Mickey, Minnie, and Pete. Lumpjaw even looks somewhat like a bear version of Pete here, and if you watched my first entry in this retrospective, you might remember that Pete was originally designed as a bear. Lumpjaw's growls and vocalizations were supplied by Jimmy McDonald, the head of Disney's sound effects department. Fun and Fancy Free was a big movie for Mr. McDonald, since it was also his first time voicing Mickey Mouse, which he continued to do for the next 30 years. None of the bears appear to like Lumpjaw, and run in terror when he lumbers onto the scene. Although they do their say it with a slap dance in celebration when it appears that Lulabelle has chosen him as a mate, it doesn't seem to be out of respect, but rather relief that Lumpjaw is in a good mood for once. Although the Bongo segment is relatively obscure today, Bongo starred in a series of comics after the first movie came out, most of them in the late 40s through the 50s. Lulabelle surprisingly made virtually no appearances, but Lumpjaw often acted as the villain. To promote the movie, a 3-part comic was printed in Walt Disney's Comics and Stories that presented an alternate version of Bongo's story. In this version, Lumpjaw and Bongo are the only bears in the forest, and Lumpjaw feels that sweet, innocent Bongo is doing a disservice to the bear's fierce reputation. Bongo fights Lumpjaw twice in a similar fashion to the way he does in the film. After 2 humiliating defeats, Lumpjaw tries to trick Bongo. He pretends to be friends with the smaller bear, while trying to make accidents befall him. Bongo smells gunpowder, and realizes a hunter is in the forest. Lumpjaw ignores Bongo's warnings, and is apparently shot a moment later. Bongo takes this remarkably well, and moves into Lumpjaw's cave. Later comics showcased Lumpjaw's antisocial tendencies toward the forest animals. He would regularly bully everyone for the fun of it, and Bongo would have to find ways to outwit Lumpjaw and restore peace. Lumpjaw would hold a particular hatred for Bongo in these stories, jealous at how the animals all admired Bongo's circus skills rather than Lumpjaw's strength. What Lumpjaw never seemed to figure out was that it wasn't Bongo's skills that made the animals like him, it was that he was kind and friendly, the exact opposite of Lumpjaw. When he tries to show off with tricks of his own, Lumpjaw often carelessly causes a great deal of damage to the woods, which doesn't help endear him to any of the animals. Don't feel too bad for Lumpjaw here. Although it may seem like he's trying to gain friends with these acts of strength, most stories made it clear that Lumpjaw wants to be admired, respected, and worshipped, but doesn't really seem all that interested in actually having friends or meaningful relationships. Several of these stories ended with Lumpjaw being captured by a zookeeper or circus worker and being taken out of the forest. Since these kinds of comics were never big on continuity, Lumpjaw would always be back in the next story, but I like to imagine that he was too much for his captors to handle for very long. Lumpjaw's oddest comic appearance was in one where he sets up a western ranch alongside other villains like Pete, Captain Hook, and the Big Bad Wolf. They want to use the ranch to entice the Wicked Witch, so she'll lend them her flying broomstick. Lumpjaw, petty as always, wants to use the broom to ruin Bongo's unicycle. According to a poster that can be seen at Storybook Circus in Walt Disney World, Lumpjaw acts as a wrestling partner to Goofy, here known as the Great Goofini. Another poster shows that Humphrey the Bear has replaced Bongo as the unicycle act, and hopefully he enjoys the circus life more than his predecessor did. The other segment in Fun and Fancy Free is Mickey and the Beanstalk, which is based on the classic fairy tale Jack and the Beanstalk. The most well-known version of the original story dates back to the 19th century, although the story's general idea is said to date back nearly 5,000 years. In the story, Jack, a poor farmer boy, finds some magic beans which he grows into a giant beanstalk reaching into the heavens. He climbs the beanstalk and finds the castle of a fearsome giant. Jack raids the castle and steals many treasures, including a magic harp and a hen that lays golden eggs. When the enraged giant chases him, Jack chops down the beanstalk and the giant falls to his death. Jack, despite being poor and wanting to help his mother, is still not the most likable character, since he basically breaks into someone else's house, takes their stuff, and kills a justifiably angry victim. Some versions even have Jack befriend the giant's wife to manipulate her into helping him steal more things. As a result, the story has been deconstructed plenty of times over the years, notably in the musical Into the Woods.
Hey look, we get it. You're little, you're down on your luck, you think, hey, he's a giant. Why don't we break into his home, rob him, and murder him?
But that's not how it went down!
Oh, well, it's going down like that.
You're both going down like that.
To combat this, some versions of the story have the giant being an evil, murdering menace himself to justify Jack's deeds. That was basically how Disney chose to approach the story. Mickey, Donald, and Goofy take up Jack's role, and this story shows them on a mission to reclaim the Golden Harp, which once lived in their kingdom of Happy Valley before being stolen by the giant. Willie the Giant is built up as an ominous figure early on, appearing as a frightening silhouette when he first steals the harp. However, when we finally get a good look at him, he is more akin to the previous year's Brer Bear, a silly, childlike character who has a certain innocence about him, despite his massive size and quick temper.
Chocolate pot roast with pistachio, with mashing, with green gravy.
Willie was voiced by comedy actor Billy Gilbert, who was known for doing exaggerated sneezing routines. In fact, he had previously voiced Sneezy the Dwarf in Snow White. As Willie, he again gets to let out one of those sneezes. Although very quick-tempered, Willie is easily tricked. Mickey is able to distract him pretty easily when Willie grabs him by offering to read his palm. Although this saves Mickey from potentially getting squashed, the mouse's next attempt to trick Willie doesn't go quite as planned. In this version of the story, Willie has shape-shifting abilities, which he demonstrates in his brief, jazzy fee-fi-fo-fum song. Mickey tries to get Willie to turn into a fly so he can get him with a fly swatter, but Willie insists on turning into a giant pink rabbit instead. He is not happy when he figures out the hero's intentions. One of Willie's defining traits is his selfishness. When he steals the harp, he plunges all of Happy Valley into famine. The harp's singing is what allows the valley to prosper, and without her, everyone faces starvation. Willie desires the harp singing himself so he can fall asleep to her music every day. It's unclear if Willie knew that stealing the harp would cause such devastation to the valley, but I'm not sure if he'd care all that much either way. Even though he caused so much trouble, Willie is another one of those villains who most people can't help but like. How can you not love someone who can transform into anything and uses it to become a pink rabbit? Disney seemed to be aware of this. When Willie appears to die at the end, depending on which version you're watching, either Mortimer Snurd or Herman the Boodle Beetle will begin to cry. The narrator, either Edgar Bergen or Ludwig von Drake, will comfort them, saying that it's just a story. Cue Willie lifting up the roof of their house, still looking for Mickey, and appearing to be just fine. As I said, this segment, like Bongo, was originally meant to be a full feature on its own, tentatively titled The Legend of Happy Valley. Many story elements and characters were cut, including the hen that laid golden eggs, played by Clara Cluck, and the Queen of Happy Valley, played by Minnie Mouse. The giant was going to have an infant son, who Mickey and friends would have accidentally woken up and would have to deal with. Other sketches show a giant kitten resembling Figaro, which would have curiously followed Donald around, who was not in the mood for playing. Willie's ability to transform into anything would have had more of an impact on the story, since it really doesn't end up getting used as much as it could have been in the final version. Early sketches show his song would have been longer, and he would have also changed into a walrus and a three-headed dragon. At the end, he would have shrank himself, but couldn't remember the magic words to change back. The story would have ended with him becoming Queen Minnie's footman, and based on the looks on everyone's faces in the concept art, they all seem okay with this arrangement. Although ultimately cut, this plot point is still foreshadowed when Willie is shown having trouble remembering the fee-fi-fo-fum words. It does at least show that Disney never intended to kill the lovable giant off. Willie showed up in a few comics after the movie, although not as many as you'd imagine. One notable story had him steal one of Santa Claus's reindeer as a pet. We meet his mother in this one, who is apparently a normal-sized woman. It's best not to dwell on that point too much. We also learn that Willie's last name is Fadadiddlehofer. Do what you will with this valuable information. In 1994, the video game Mickey Mania was released for the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and Sega CD. The game featured levels based on many of Mickey's classic cartoons, including Mickey and the Beanstalk. Willie himself did not appear, however. In 1996, a version of the game called Mickey's Wild Adventures was released for PlayStation, and had a new level where Willie does finally show up, chasing Mickey away from his castle. Another game, Castle of Illusion, had Mickey fighting a character known as the Oafish Clockmaker. He somewhat resembled Willie, and in the game's later remake, he looked even more like the giant, only scaled down a bit and with black hair. Although concept art for the Disney Villain's Revenge game shows a level featuring Willie, it never made it into the final version. Willie's big comeback was in Mickey's Christmas Carol. As I discussed in my first So Many Christmas Carols video, Mickey's Christmas Carol began as a record in 1974, telling the Dickens story with Disney characters. In this version, Willie was voiced by Walker Edmiston. The story was then reworked as an animated short in 1983, and Willie was played by Will Ryan this time.
And don't forget the chocolate pot roast with pistachio. With pistachio. With yogurt.
Will Ryan would continue to be Willie's voice actor in every appearance the Giant has made since then. In Willie's recent appearances, like on the Mickey Mouse Clubhouse, he is friends with everyone. This makes sense to me, since even in his most selfish moments in his earliest days, he still came across as someone who just needed some friends to show him the right way to act. Fun and fancy-free was not the only time Mickey tangled with the Giant. In fact, he had 2 previous encounters with these oversized ogres. The first was Rumplewatt from the 1933 cartoon Giantland. This story was also based on Jack and the Beanstalk, albeit more loosely. In the cartoon, Mickey tells a group of smaller mice about how he climbed a beanstalk to a giant's castle. Mickey enters as Rumplewatt the Giant marches onto the scene. Voiced by an unidentified actor, Rumplewatt sings about how he is king of the giants and prince of the tyrants. Mickey hides on Rumplewatt's table and almost gets eaten. When he's discovered, Mickey runs with the giant in hot pursuit. Instead of chopping down the beanstalk, Mickey sets it on fire, which gets the same result. Rumplewatt falls to Earth, making a huge crater, and according to Mickey, coming out in China. Earlier drafts of the cartoon had Rumplewatt acting more evil and keeping the little mice Mickey narrates to as slaves, and Mickey being their liberator. It was most likely simplified for budgetary reasons, although Rumplewatt comes across as less of a villain in the finished version, since although he brags about being a tyrant, the only reason he chases Mickey appears to be because the mouse is an intruder. Another version of the story was in the Mickey Mouse comic strip, which is where Rumplewatt received his name. He's never named in the actual cartoon. This story was much more elaborate and made Rumplewatt more of a classic villain. Mickey journeys up to his castle to retrieve the goose that lays the golden eggs, which the giant stole from a kingdom of dwarves. Mickey is given a lift to the castle by a princess who was cursed to be a giant butterfly. Rumplewatt killed her mother, and the curse will only be broken when the giant himself dies. On the way to the castle, they fight Rumplewatt's guard, Yosef, the singing vulture. True to his title, all of Yosef's dialogue consists of bits and pieces of popular songs. In the end of this version, Mickey blows up Rumplewatt's castle using the many kegs in his powder room. Rumplewatt is blown to the moon, and then falls back to Earth to his death. The goose is returned to the dwarves, and the princess turns back into her true form, which is, of course, Minnie Mouse. Honestly, I prefer the comic version to the cartoon. Either way, it's fun to see them laying the groundwork for Mickey and the Beanstalk. Somewhat better known than Rumplewatt is Gustav from 1938's Brave Little Tailor. Based on the fairy tale of the same name, sometimes called The Valiant Little Tailor, the original story was about a clever tailor who outsmarted giants with what amounted to sleight of hand tricks and other quick-witted tactics. The Mickey Mouse version is more based on physical humor, with Mickey using his tailor skills to sew up the giant and trip him. Gustav enjoys simple pleasures: eating, drinking, and smoking. Of course, to a giant, this involves the destruction of countless crops and houses. Like Willie, Gustav is dangerously careless about how his actions affect those beneath him. He is less talkative, however. He's voiced by Eddie Holden and only gets about 2 words of dialogue. He's well animated enough that he doesn't need to say much to convey what he wants. Like Rumplewatt, Gustav was not named in his cartoon, but received his name in the comics. He was the antagonist of a comic about Thumper the Rabbit meeting the 7 dwarves. Gustav finds Thumper and takes him home to his lovely wife as a pet. A good deal of the comic focuses on Thumper's escape with the help of Doc and Dopey. Gustav antagonizes forest dwellers in a few other comics, most of which I detailed in a previous episode about the strange follow-up stories written for Dumbo. One Gustav appearance that's actually quite near and dear to my heart is in the book Mickey and the Giant, a more straightforward adaptation of the original Tailor story, which focuses on Mickey outwitting the giant with simple tricks. One of my earliest memories is breaking my arm when I was around 2 years old, and my parents reading me this book in the waiting room of the hospital. I'm just happy I didn't grow up to associate Mickey Mouse with a childhood trauma, or I wouldn't be making these videos. That about covers this entry. Disney's next movie was Melody Time, but it's pretty scarce in the villains department. Aside from a group of bandits Pecos Bill defeats, the closest thing to a bad guy is Bill's horse, Widowmaker. He more or less murders Bill's fiancée, something that no one seems to really acknowledge much. It's actually pretty disturbing. Either way, we'll be moving past Melody Time for this reason straight to the adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. This blessed animation fans with the one and only Headless Horseman, along with a gang of weasels that have stuck around for the long haul.
There are giants in the sky. There are big, tall, terrible giants in the sky.
This giant was so big, he could squish a man just like you could squish a bug.